Yeah!
So I'm Anahid, and my paper is titled Nationalism and the Internal Enemy in Raffi's The Fool. And it deals with this novel, published in 1881 in Eastern Armenia. And it's considered to be almost the Bible of the revolutionary movement, Armenian revolutionary movement. But as a result, is rarely ever really approached as a literary text. And I'm not necessarily arguing that it's quality literature here, but I think it's an important historical text, and I hope you'll enjoy how I engage it with Carl Schmitt's theory. In 1881, Persian-Armenian author Raffi, the pen name of Hagop Melik Hagopian, published Khenta, The Fool, a historical novelization of a journalistic venture to chronicle the last Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 78. Set at the twilight of the Ottoman Empire, the novel functions as both a record of the Ottoman Armenian identity and a criticism of it. Raffi juxtaposes the subservient mentalities of the Ottoman Armenian peasants in the village of O to that of the fool, a blanket term used by the villagers to mockingly refer to young nationalists from Russia and Istanbul, to construct an argument for the necessity of an Armenian struggle for freedom and nationhood. Through his detailed descriptions of the cultural practices and interactions of O's Armenian, Kurdish, and Turkish inhabitants in the months leading up to the war, Raffi reveals the complex societal structures that forced the Armenians, a Christian minority with limited rights, to remain removed from the nationalist concept until the latter half of the 19th century. Furthermore, these complex structures are the basis for an understanding of how the Armenians determined both friend and enemy, not only as victims of the fray in the Russian-Turkish conflict, but also in the last years preceding the series of massacres that would eventually lead to the Armenian genocide of 1915, 27 years after Raffi's death, and the 96th anniversary was yesterday. Yet the complex societal structures in question here are not necessarily those that demarcate the various religious and/or ethnic sects of the Ottoman Empire. Rather, as is made plain by the end of the novel, the most complex structure of all is that of the Ottoman Armenian society itself. Despite the nationalist character's aspirations to catalyze a revolutionary movement that would protect the Armenians from disappearing altogether as the Ottomans made a last bid for the existence of their empire, little progress is made toward this goal by the end of the novel. The Armenians remain docile and divided. The nationalists have failed to engage the peasant class in their fight, and the peasants themselves have succumbed to their impending dark fate. The innate subservience, a conditioned attitude developed over 5 centuries of Ottoman occupation, that pervades the majority peasant class is one half of its ultimate downfall. This, along with the presence of a traitor within the Armenians' midst, is the Achilles heel of the nationalist dream for a cohesive, sovereign, and homogeneous Armenian nation. Functioning as both figurative and tangible viruses, the seemingly ineradicable tendency toward mental bondage and the physical presence of the traitor perpetually infect the Armenian community and stunt its potential to overcome. This metaphorically medical state is insurmountable in the Levinasian sense, but rather than existing as simply an allergy, as Levinas would call it, the threat at hand is a non-preventable, virus-like invader who merely retreats and prepares to attack once more indefinitely. The threat of internal combustion within the Armenian nation is always lurking in the midst of the Armenian community itself, always already preparing to re-emerge. I've engaged my reading of The Fool with German jurist Carl Schmitt's The Concept of the Political, which is based on Schmitt's postulation that the creation of a politically viable state is contingent upon a distinction between one's friend and enemy. Only then does an entity possess the potential for combat and establish sovereignty. Yet Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction dictates an external demarcation, where the friends and enemies exist outside of the self, unless the self is one's only friend, of course. Schmitt requires an identification of the enemy, suggesting that such a presence or figure is visible and detectable, a state that can only exist within the self's field of perception, the external. However, to borrow from Levinas once more, if, quote, the outside of me is for me, end quote, would not the search for the external enemy ultimately lead back to the self? In this sense, the combustion taking place within the Armenian community embodies what Schmitt briefly identifies as the internal or domestic enemy, and explodes the idea of the nationalistic and Schmittian notion of the homogeneous nation that stands in relief amidst a sea of identifiable external enemies. In other words, the Fool represents the internal conflicts of the enemy, it being the Armenian community itself, and gives no indication of progress toward a purification or homogenization that would eradicate the internal enemy and make it possible for the Armenians to construct a nation by distinguishing between their external friends and enemies. In this way, Schmidt's friend-enemy distinction, so long as it assumes that the self or distinguishing entity is homogeneous, is not only superseded, but preceded by the ever-present infection of the self, by the ineradicable internal enemy. First and foremost, Schmidt states that, quote, the concept of the political presupposes the concept of the state. In other words, the existence or establishment of the political is an absolute precondition for the existence or establishment of the state. Schmidt defines the state fundamentally as, quote, a specific entity of a people, which is in the decisive case, the ultimate authority. The state, then, is not necessarily a marked territory or government. It is simply a grouping of people, or a grouping representative of a people, who are in a position to take decisive action. Schmidt asserts that, quote, the specific political distinction to which political action can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. That in the instance that a friend and enemy distinction is made, the involved entity becomes political. The term political entails the state of seeking out power and status, which is a process that would certainly require a clear understanding of what needs to be overpowered in order to overcome and surpass it. Raffi writes The Fool in order to break down the friend-enemy distinctive process for the Armenian peasant, and in turn creates an argument for a politicization of the Armenian nation. He indicates who is to be trusted, the nationalist fool, and distrusted, and therefore indicates the need for independence, thus fashioning a political entity for the Ottoman Armenian people to adopt. Schmidt explains that such decisiveness immediately submits to the political entity the, quote, jus belli, i.e., the real possibility of deciding in a concrete situation upon the enemy and the ability to fight him with the power emanating from the entity. As long as a politically united people is prepared to fight for its existence, independence, and freedom on the basis of a decision emanating from the political entity, this specifically political question has primacy over the technical means by which the battle will be waged. End quote. Schmidt's theory aligns with the fool's true belief in the possibility of, quote, freedom from oppression. If the Armenian peasant decides to overcome his docile position in the Ottoman context, that political decision on its own is immediately more important and powerful than the actual logistics of success. Throughout The Fool, Raffi depicts the community in O as a hierarchy in which the Armenian peasants remain subordinate to the roaming Kurds, who are in turn secondary to the Turks. The Armenian characters in the novel regularly endure physical, financial, and verbal abuses from their Muslim countrymen, yet remain subservient for the sake of survival. The nationalist fools in the novel attempt repeatedly to convince the peasants that they ought to defend themselves from the Kurds and Turks, emerge from their position as a Christian minority in a Muslim empire, and eventually create and rule over their own homeland. The nationalists are vehicles for Raffi's own ideology. He attempts to politicize the Ottoman Armenians by instructing them on who is their enemy, the Turk and Kurd, and who is their friend, anyone but the Turk and Kurd. However, Raffi's disdain for the Armenian merchant, a traditionally Turkified figure who forsakes ethnic solidarity for personal gain, is a direct identification of an internal enemy far greater than any external Turkish or Kurdish one. The character in question is Tomas Efendi, Efendi meaning lord in Turkish, an Armenian merchant and tax collector who takes advantage of Armenian peasants' trust in order to learn of their transgressions and swiftly reports them to the Turkish authorities for the benefit of his own status and wealth. Raffi's contempt is evident from his introductory description of Tomas Efendi as, I'm going to launch into Armenian, Mi shadachos chapepa garjlik galorig mart vorpati martits amen paninamane, which translates to a deceitful, roly-poly, talkative fellow who is anything but a true human being. The ig suffix at the end of garj, meaning short, and galor, meaning round, is diminutive, used often as an indicator of endearment when referring to a child. As used here, however, ig conveys smallness, Raffi's underhanded mockery of the Effendi's inflated ego. However, the Effendi's character occupies a far more serious and dangerous position in the novel, particularly when he betrays the hiding place of the young nationalist Mr. Salman, who is one half of the fool, to the Turkish authorities. Raffi slowly builds the layers of the Effendi's deception to emphasize his role as an enabler, without whom the Turkish authorities are less likely to swarm the Armenian peasants. In this way, the Armenian Effendi is a greater enemy than the Turks themselves. Schmidt's ideas about the declaration of the internal enemy in the political state explain Raffi's singling out of the Armenian merchant who, despite his ethnic relation to the Armenian peasant, betrays those like Mr. Salman. Schmidt says that the enemy is not merely any competitor or just any partner of a conflict in general. The internal enemy is separate from the external, often easier to identify enemy. The Armenians' Muslim countrymen, the Turks being their ruling oppressors, with the Kurds as their minions, would be the most obvious choice for the role of enemy in this historical moment. However, the Ottoman government at that time was not in a position to investigate its peasant class on a regular basis, and instead relied on the cunning of its Armenian allies to find reasons for persecution beyond the existing laws that limited all non-Muslim minorities. Merchants like the Effendi, then, are internal or domestic enemies that lurk amongst the Armenians. Raffi's narrative insists that such figures must therefore not be trusted, and that the Armenians must instead approach them with constant vigilance. It must be made clear, though, that Schmidt himself does not take the threat of the internal enemy into serious consideration when postulating on the necessity of the friend-enemy distinction. While his particular guidelines, so to speak, for the making of this distinction do serve to point out the flaws in nationalist desires within the framework of the fool, the ultimate weakness, ignorance of the internal enemy's presence and potential of these desires, is also that of Schmidt's own theory. Whether this internal enemy takes the form of a physical being, such as the character of the Effendi, or of an attitude, such as the, quote, disunity, dissension, jealousy, and enmity, end quote, that plagues the Ottoman Armenians in the novel, it continuously presents a threat to the stability and cohesion of any group striving for political viability. The Fool serves as a direct example of this phenomenon. Schmidt attempts to reckon with this very real presence very briefly in the 5th section of his text, ultimately suggesting that to, quote, declare such an enemy is possibly the sign of civil war, i.e. the dissolution of the state as an organized political entity, internally peaceful, territorially enclosed, and impenetrable to aliens, end quote. The homogeneity suggested by the last qualifier serves to affirm Schmidt's preference for this mode of declaration of the internal enemy. In fact, Schmidt has no qualms about the potential for violence inherent in the possibility of civil war, and lays plain the reality that the, quote, further fate of this entity will be decided by the power of weapons, end quote. Yet if this is the case, would that not doom the entity to a permanent state of total war? Schmidt's brief reckoning with the internal enemy assumes that in the process of achieving homogeneity, in thought and in population, any and all methods, war included, are necessary means to a desirable end. That is, if there is an end in sight. The case presented in The Fool is evidence, in addition to several contemporary examples on the global scale, that the declaration of the internal enemy is not a one-time, containable event. The threat is always already there, including once it appears to have been eradicated. We may look to Etienne Balibar to understand this flaw in Schmidt's ideation. By condoning whatever process an entity deems necessary in the name of homogeneity, Schmidt is arguing for a universalized identity in which, quote, there should not exist natural or inherited differences between the men who belong to the same nation, as Balibar puts it. Schmidt's friend-enemy distinction is crucial to this process because it allows the nation to distinguish itself from amongst the rest of the population based on essential or particular differences between the members of the nation and those not in the nation. Schmidt's theory is dependent on the assumption that the entity or nation has been totally filtered of particularistic attributes. But if that is a condition a group may find itself in solely through combat and civil war, then it is simply an impossible one. Not only do we have the paradox of universalism paired with particularism pointing to this impossibility, but the example of The Fool serves to further underscore the self-destructive autoimmune process through which any hope for a unified nation is dashed into oblivion. Because the infection has already taken hold, and even if it is treated, one can assume that a new form of it is always already acting in its place. Ultimately, the existence of the internal enemy within the Armenians' midst precedes any discussion of the jus belli, political viability or statehood. Schmidt's advocacy for an entity that is, quote, impenetrable to aliens, whether those be human invaders, contra-thought, or internal traitors, is just as idealistic as the Armenian nationalist dream itself. Thank you.